Chapter 9. Bomber Operations on 218. Squadron number 218, Gold Coast. Squadron was first formed in 1918 and fought in France in World War I, but was disbanded in 1919. The squadron crest was an hourglass with the sand running out, thereby symbolizing its formation late in the war, but in time to serve with distinction. The squadron motto in time suitably recognized that fact. The squadron was reformed in 1936 and served from then, right to the end of World War II, becoming one of comparatively few squadrons to serve continuously throughout the war against Germany. The Gold Coast part was because the squadron had been adopted by that West African colony. It is of some coincidence that the squadron motto also applied to my own situation, since I joined it later in the war, but in time to complete a tour of bomber ops. The squadron, when I joined them, had been recently equipped with Lancaster Mk3 aircraft, and had moved to R.A.F. Methil in Norfolk in August, 1944. My crew and I joined the squadron 1 month later, on the 18th of September. After carrying out joining formalities, we started flying on the 23rd of September. Methil was a wartime airfield with 3 runways in a triangular pattern. It was, like so many others, a widely dispersed camp with living accommodation 2 miles away from the operational facilities and with the officers' and sergeants' messes even further dispersed. There was another squadron, number 149 on the base, also equipped with Lancasters. In all there were over 30 aircraft on the 2 squadrons dispersed in small groups all around the airfield. The wide dispersal of facilities and aircraft was designed to minimize damage or losses due to enemy activity or by accidents. As usual, we were issued with bicycles to cover the large distances between the various campsites. My accommodation was some 2 miles away from the mess, the squadron officers and briefing rooms. The 2 squadrons were briefed together in one large main briefing room since they carried out identical operations. Although we shared the same basic accommodation and messes, there was a friendly, but healthy rivalry between the 2 squadrons. Personnel were varied in their origins, especially amongst the crew who came from all over the British Commonwealth. 218 Squadron had, at the time I joined them, a large number of Australians than any other Commonwealth Air Force personnel. Over 60% of the captains were R.A.A.F. After a day cross-country to get used to the aircraft and the general flying setup, I carried out my first night bomber operation. The policy was for the captain to carry out his first operation as a co-pilot to one of the experienced crews. I was fortunate to fly with Flight Lieutenant Chuck Young and his crew of Aussies, most of whom came from Sydney. They treated me very well and encouraged me in every way, which helped ease the natural apprehension one felt when flying one's first operation. The pattern of all operations were much the same. We were to take off around dusk, so no one counted back from that point. The crew would go to the aircraft earlier in the day and check the aircraft on the ground, each group member carrying out tests on their specialist equipment. These tests took place after the crew had been detailed for that night's ops, by the announcement of a battle order for the night, detailing crews and assigning aircraft to them. After the first few ops, crews usually were allocated their own aircraft for the rest of the tour of operations. The next point of main interest was to learn the composition of the aircraft fuel and bomb load. The balance between the two gave a clear idea of how deep the penetration into enemy territory was planned. The aircraft had a maximum all-up weight and a maximum payload, so the more fuel required, the less bombs could then be carried. If the fuel load was the maximum of 2,000 gallons, then at only 7,000 pounds of bomb load could be lifted. We learned that we were to carry a full bomb load of 14,000 pounds and a fuel load to match. This information meant a penetration of the western side of Germany and not much further than a line down from north to south, just the other side of the Ruhr Valley. This area was known to crews, rather ironically, as Happy Valley, because it was the most heavily defended area of Germany. Chuck Young took me under his wing and I went through all the things that he did prior to the raid. The timings were published on the battle order to the following example for a night op. 1600 pre-flying meal, usually bacon and eggs. 1700 briefing for navigators and wireless operators. 1800 main briefing, all crew members. 1830 transport to aircraft. 1930 takeoff. The crews did not learn what the target was until briefing, in the interests of intelligence security. Thus, the navigators and wireless operators knew first at their earlier briefing. On reporting to the briefing room, firstly one looked at the large map on the wall where the route to and from the target was depicted by a line of colored ribbon. As we entered the room we could see it as a glance where we were off to. On this occasion, we saw the route line pointing to the Ruhr, and on joining the other crew members learned that the city of Dusseldorf was the target. The specific target was to be a large factory site. I then knew that my first initiation was to be the toughest area in Germany to go in terms of enemy air defenses. Readers can imagine that one has to work hard to overcome the natural fears that crews suffer before each operation. My own crew had wished me well before I went to briefing. For them too it was an anxious time, knowing that they could lose their captain on his first op, and without them. I figured that they would be even more worried if they knew what I knew. Chuck and his crew were carrying out their 25th operation, so were reasonably used to it all, as much as one could ever get used to the ordeal crews went through. We settled down at the crew table where the navigator had all his prepared maps and charts and other data for the trip. The captain then being prepared his own information, which included route details, radio, fuel and bomb load and aircraft technical information, etc. The squadron commanding officer, Wing Commander Fenwick Wilson, with whom I had an interview on joining the squadron, came into the briefing. Accompanied by the station commander Group Captain Brian Yard, who was the epitome of a military officer. We all stood to attention and the CO told us then to sit down as he commenced the briefing. He formally opened by confirming the target and being invited the various specialist leaders to give their briefing information. These included firstly, a comprehensive, meteorological briefing, then the pilot, navigator, bombing, gunnery, and signals engineer leaders. Gave the main specialist details necessary for all the crew to know what was required of them and in general terms what each member's part in the operation included. It was, of course, essential that the captain had this overall knowledge in order to make the immediate decisions throughout the operation. Posted with the map was a graphic picture of the heights, speeds, climbs and descents the whole force had to follow. The raid was to include other groups than number 3 group and would have a total of over 600 bombers flying in a closed stream plan to complete their passage through their targets in half an hour. Special attention to route details was essential to achieve maximum concentration on the target and to minimize the risk of collisions. Bomber Command had experienced a devastating loss due to an earlier raid on Nuremberg, when 94 aircraft had been lost, a sizable number of them in reported mid-air collisions. When over 700 crew had been lost. The whole force of several hundred had arrived earlier than the Pathfinder Marker force and had carried out an orbit in target the area, whilst waiting the arrival. Not surprisingly under tremendous risk of collision. After Nuremberg, crews were instructed not to orbit in the target area and also in future raids en route course alterations were to be of no more than 30 degrees, on any one change. To return to my briefing, which continued with the intelligence officer giving details of the expected enemy defenses. Also other friendly forces taking part in the total effort of Bomber Command that night. It was normal for diversionary raids to be flown by a high-flying force of the faster Mosquito aircraft. Various other diversionary tactics were employed, often by aircraft of number 100 group. This group specialized in measures to deceive the enemy defenses. We ourselves would at a given point entering enemy territory. Push out bundles of metal strip called window designed to totally clutter up enemy radar screens and make it nigh on impossible for them to detect where the main force was heading. Routes to the target were designed to make it difficult for the enemy to decide precisely which target the force was heading for, thereby making it harder for them to direct their night fighter force to intercept the bomber force. The briefing also included air traffic details, final timing adjustments, and lastly, a few comments and good wishes from the squadron and station commanders. The final briefing was usually over in about half an hour and then it was off to waiting transport, driven mainly by girls in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. These girls were marvelous and got to know the crews well, usually getting themselves to drive the same crews whenever they could. They also waited anxiously when the aircraft returned, hoping to spot their aircraft and crew arriving. Often these girls were in tears when their crew did not return. In many cases, of course, they had boyfriends in the crew they were driving, so then it became even more emotional for them. It was also great for the crews to be met by a friendly, familiar face, and a lady especially. It would ease the tremendous strain the crews had been under for the past long hours. Chuck and his crew and I drove out to their dispersed Lancaster to give the aircraft a final check and test run the engines and equipment. Since it still left almost an hour before the takeoff, it gave time for the aircraft ground crews to put right any last-minute defects. The members of the ground crew were totally dedicated to their kite and made every effort to have everything 100% serviceable for the crew on the arrival. The dedication was clearly evident by the fact that it was rare to find much wrong on these final checks. In winter, these chaps spent hours in the cold working to keep the aircraft serviceable, without the glamour that air crews enjoyed. There was a wonderful comradeship between air and ground crews, each respecting one another's dedication and special qualifications. All being ready, the final moments were always a tense and nervous time, whilst waiting for takeoff time. Normally, the CO, if he was not flying, or the flight commanders made a quick visit to teach crew and to give them any last-minute instructions and a final good luck wish. Then it was into the aircraft, each member taking up their crew position. As soon as the crew was settled in, the captain would call for each crew member to report on intercommunication that they were ready. This was done in an orderly manner, avoiding everyone calling at once. It started from the forward members down to the rear gunner, in his lonely position in the rear turret. There was radio silence, so no calls were made outside the aircraft on the VHF or other radios. This kept the situation secure from any outside agency trying to pick up information to pass to the enemy. Engines were started, and at a given minute the aircraft began taxiing out to the takeoff point. It was a thrilling moment as the long line of the aircraft snaked their way to the runway. A caravan was parked just alongside the runway, where a controller gave each aircraft a green light on an Alice signal lamp to take off, or a red light to wait. Green light received and the Lancaster was taxied onto the runway by Chuck Young and held on the brakes. The engines were run up to 2000 RPM, then a message from the captain. Stand by for takeoff. Brakes released and the big heavily laden aircraft slowly moved down the runway. There was always a group of well-wishers by the caravan, and they could be seen to wave farewell as the aircraft moved down the takeoff run. Gathering power and speed, the aircraft accelerated to takeoff speed, taking almost the full length of the runway, and slowly the weight could be felt lifting off the wheels and then off the runway. As the aircraft climbed into the dusky night ahead, wheels came up and power was reduced, and then climbing speed reached, followed by a gentle turn onto the first heading. As it was not fully dark, we could see the black shapes of the other aircraft climbing out. This was always an exciting period and varied according to the weather and the light as to how much you could see of the other bombers. Sometimes you went into cloud soon after takeoff and saw no other aircraft, but just felt a bump now and again as you caught a slipstream of an aircraft close ahead. This night we climbed through a layer of cloud, and on top it was still light enough to see the other aircraft appearing out of the cloud. Gradually, more and more bombers could be seen as aircraft from other places joined up at the various rendezvous points en route. The initial height to fly varied from raid to raid, and as a variable tactic, sometimes the force would go out low level so as to make it difficult for the enemy to pick up the force on radar. Then there would be a rapid climb to bombing height. On this occasion we continued a steady climb up to bombing height. Gradually, for by now all navigation lights were switched off, the shapes of other aircraft were lost in the oncoming darkness. One of the amazing things about these raids is that often you could go throughout the raid and not see another aircraft once it got dark. And yet you knew there were several hundred aircraft flying in a great gaggle over a short distance and the total size of force. This happened to us and we settled down over the North Sea. The bombs were all set, live, after the final bomb released checks had been made by the bomb MA. Inside the aircraft only minimal light was on and the crew members moved about the aircraft using only a dimmed torchlight. The navigator and wireless operator had more light but worked behind curtains to block the light from being seen outside. We were now approaching the Dutch coast, after about an hour out, and could expect to see the German anti-aircraft defenses in action as the force crossed the coast. The crew were brought to alert by the captain warning enemy coast ahead. From this point on we could expect a mixture of searchlights, anti-aircraft fire and the presence of the enemy night fighters. I felt the dryness in my mouth and throat and pondered on what to expect. In the event we saw a few flickering arms of searchlight beams searching the sky, and as we crossed the coast, some gunfire. Shells that came close could be heard exploding as a muffled thump above the roar of the 4 engines on the Lancaster. We soon passed this initial defense screen without incident, and an alteration onto the next leg of our route was made. We were now about an hour from Dusseldorf and could expect fighters all the way into the target. The crew were on maximum alert from here to the target. And occasional bump from a slipstream was slightly uncomfortable, but reassured us that we were firmly in the bomber stream. The captain had now selected the VHS frequency to listen out for the master bomber's instruction. This system had been developed as the bomber effort gathered momentum. The Pathfinder Marker Force had been formed mostly from crews on their second tour whose job it was, using special electronic navigation equipment called oboe, to identify the target, and then by dropping colored markers. The main force dropped their bombs when these markers came into bomb aimers' vision on the bomb site. Crews were told at briefing precisely what color markers were being used that night, which varied on each raid and were red, green, yellow or combinations of these. In the event of the target being covered in cloud, special colored sky markers called Newmarket or Wanui floated on parachutes and hovered above the cloud. The crews dropping their bombs using these markers. Each raid had designated master bombers, usually 2, one being the deputy. These very experienced and courageous men flew low over the target and stayed circling the area, giving revised instructions to the bombers telling them where to drop from markers. Normally, this type of instruction would comprise an order to bomb so many seconds after the bomb MA had the marker flares in his bomb site. The whole idea was to achieve maximum concentration and accuracy of the attack. We were now getting close and we found the target area covered in cloud and no sky markers. We were instructed by the master bomber to bomb on target ETA as the original markets were now obscured by cloud. However, we could see a large glow in the target area lighting up the cloud, and this came from the bombs dropped from the aircraft ahead of us. Flak, AA gunfire, was now becoming quite intense and searchlights were weaving over the sky, seeking bombers as targets for the waiting night fighters to attack. We watched one aircraft get caught in a searchlight beam and weave and dive like a moth caught in a light trying to escape. Then there was a flash and we realized that he had been blown up either by gunfire or by a fighter attack. There was a steady thump of shells exploding nearby, but fortunately we did not get hit. Now we started our bombing run and the captain handed over to the bomb MA for verbal instructions for the bomb drop. The bomb MA acknowledged and began directing the run. Bomb doors opened steady. The aircraft was rumbling from the turbulence created by the resistance to that airflow the bomb doors created in their open position. Finally, steady, bombs gone, and we felt that the aircraft rise as the 14,000 pounds of bombs left and fell away to the target. The bomb MA called bomb doors closed. The wireless operator, standing over the bomb bay, had been ready to hack the cable holding the 4,000 cookie bomb, had it not gone away on release by the bomb MA. However, all was well and the aircraft smoothed up as the bomb doors closed. The captain, who, until the bombing run, had been flying the aircraft on a constant but gentle weave to foil radar detection designed to give the fighters and anti-aircraft gunners a firm target, now put the aircraft into a dive. Normally, the route from the target involved a predetermined shallow dive and build-up of speed to about 200 knots in order to clear the target area quickly. Then we flew into some cloud and felt even safer as we moved away and on our journey home. One could feel a sense of relief after this phase, but no drop in crew alertness. The German night fighters would now, of course, be around the mainstream of bombers and urgently seeking targets to shoot down. It seemed an age at first, but actually we soon seemed to be crossing out of Germany and over the coast into the North Sea again. Always the first part of relief was to clear Germany, because, over the Low Countries and France, if you were shot down there was a chance you might get back home with the aid of resistance forces. They would endeavor to hide you from the Germans until you could be passed down the line and out of France into Spain and onto Gibraltar. We carried photos for French and Belgium identity cards, and for these we had been photographed in civilian clothes. We also carried personal escape kits with foreign money, maps, concealed compasses and various other aids to help us evade or escape from the Germans. We crossed the Dutch coast and settled in the descent for the last half-hour's run to the English coast. As we crossed the coast, the aircraft all around put their navigation lights on and one wondered where they all had been. The sky seemed once more full of aircraft, all happily seeking their way home to their own bases. The navigator gave the final instructions as we headed for Metheld. Now, of course, the captain would break radio silence and call the tower on the VHF to obtain landing instructions, which he duly did. We circled round the approach lighting system and landed. After landing, we were taken by our transport for debriefing, where on arrival we were given a hot cup of coffee laced with rum. Then we were assigned a table to be debriefed by an intelligence officer where the crew gave a full report on the raid. Then it was off to the mess for the inevitable bacon and eggs. Finally, a very tired chap, I went to bed, but too wound up to sleep. It had been an unforgettable experience and I felt so much happier after completing my first operation. I felt safer and surely wiser and better equipped to lead my crew on future operations. Chuck Young and his crew had only 5 more to complete their tour. They were an efficient, confident and happy team and it had been an honor to fly with them. I now hope that I could work my crew to be as successful and as good as they were. Chuck and crew complete their tour and went home to Australia. Very sadly, I was to learn after the war that Chuck had been killed flying Dakotas on operations in Papua New Guinea. A fine son of Australia had been lost at so young an age. My heart always cries for these wonderful young men who came so far to fight for the Commonwealth. Living in New Zealand as I do, I am still with so many diggers and Kiwis who were fortunate to survive. The morning following the raid, after a sleep-in, I met my crew who greeted me with relief and interest, pleased to see me safely back, and keen to know how I got on. We had a crew chat on what I have learned and how we might apply the lesson to our own efforts. I was very happy to have flown my first op and not been found wanting. At least I had become operational and I now look forward to taking my crew to a successful tour of ops.